Welcome to Nightmare Fuel Stories. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoy the stories. Wait 3 seconds. I should have known something was wrong when the job posting offered twice the standard rate for equipment removal. But after 6 months of unemployment and mounting bills, I wasn't in a position to ask too many questions. The contract was simple enough: strip all salvageable equipment from the decommissioned Blackrock Weather Station, a remote facility that had been monitoring atmospheric conditions in the Colorado Rockies for 30 years before budget cuts shut it down. The drive up the mountain took 3 hours on increasingly narrow roads. The last 20 miles were nothing but gravel and switchbacks, my truck's engine straining against the altitude. When the weather station finally came into view, perched on a windswept plateau like some kind of technological monastery, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the October air. The facility consisted of 3 buildings: a main operations center, a smaller residential structure, and a maintenance shed. Various monitoring equipment dotted the surrounding area: anemometers, radiation shields, and a towering communications array that creaked ominously in the constant wind. Everything looked exactly as I'd expected, except for one detail that made me pause with my hand on the truck's door handle. Several windows in the operations center were glowing with the soft blue light of active computer screens. I pulled out my phone and called Marcus, my contact at the contracting company. "Hey, you didn't mention the power would still be on at the site." "Power?" His voice crackled through the poor connection. "There shouldn't be any power. Place has been dark for 8 months. I looked at the building again. The lights were definitely on. Well, someone forgot to flip the switch. Half the building's lit up like Christmas. Static filled the line for several seconds. Look, just do the job, okay? Strip what you can and get out. Weather's supposed to turn bad up there tonight." The call dropped before I could respond. I stared at my phone's display. No signal. Great. I grabbed my tools and headed for the main building. The front door was secured with a simple padlock that the bolt cutters made short work of. Inside, the air was stale but warm, humming with the sound of active electronics. Emergency lighting cast everything in that familiar institutional glow, and somewhere deeper in the building, I could hear the steady whir of cooling fans. The main operations room was a time capsule from the early 2000s: banks of CRT monitors, tower computers with blinking LEDs, and walls covered in charts and measurement devices. Most of the screens were displaying screensavers or login prompts, but several showed active weather data: current temperature, wind speed, barometric pressure, all updating in real time. I found the main power panel and threw the breaker. The lights went out, the humming stopped, and blessed silence filled the building. I waited a few minutes for my eyes to adjust, then got to work by flashlight. The first few hours went smoothly. Most of the equipment was standard stuff: computers, monitors, printers, various scientific instruments that would fetch decent money on the surplus market. I loaded everything into the truck, making multiple trips across the windswept plateau. The isolation was getting to me. The only sounds were the constant wind and the occasional groan of the communications tower. It was around 4 in the afternoon when I noticed the lights were on again. I stood outside the building, staring at the glowing windows. I was certain I'd killed the power. More than certain, I'd been working in the dark for hours. But there they were, those same blue screens flickering in the operations room. Back inside, I found the power panel. The main breaker was still in the off position, but somehow electricity was flowing through the building. I flipped it back and forth several times, but nothing changed. The screens kept displaying their data, the fans kept spinning, and those fluorescent lights kept casting their cold glow over everything. "Backup generator," I muttered to myself. That had to be it. There was probably an automatic system that kicked in after a few hours. I'd seen similar setups at other facilities. I spent another hour searching for the generator, checking the maintenance shed and walking the perimeter of the compound. Nothing. No generator housing, no fuel tanks, no exhaust vents. Whatever was powering the building, it wasn't coming from any backup system I could find. The wind was picking up and dark clouds were rolling in from the west. I decided to work faster and worry about the power situation later. But as I disconnected the last of the computers in the main room, something on one of the monitors caught my eye. It was displaying a weather map of the local area, with the station's position marked by a pulsing red dot. But according to the timestamp in the corner, the data was from tomorrow, not just tomorrow, 3 days from now. The display showed a massive storm system moving through the area, with wind speeds that would make travel impossible. I laughed nervously. Obviously, the system's clock was screwed up. These old computers were notorious for losing track of time, especially when they'd been sitting idle for months. I made a mental note to check the BIOS settings later, then continued with my work. By 6 o'clock, I'd loaded most of the portable equipment. The truck was getting full, and my back was aching from all the lifting. I decided to call it a day and finish up in the morning. The residential building looked like it had a decent bed, and camping there would save me the 3-hour drive back down the mountain. The residential structure was smaller but just as well preserved as the operations center. It had obviously been designed for the skeleton crew that manned the station: a small kitchen, a common area, and 4 individual bedrooms. I picked the cleanest looking room and dumped my overnight gear on the narrow bed. That's when I heard the voices. They were coming from the operations center, muffled by distance and wind, but definitely human. Multiple people talking in urgent, overlapping conversations. I grabbed my flashlight and headed back across the compound. The building was still lit, still humming with electronic activity. But as I approached the main operations room, the voices stopped. I pushed through the door and found the space exactly as I'd left it, empty, with half the equipment missing and cables scattered across the floor. The monitors were still active, still displaying their impossible future weather data. I stood there for several minutes, listening, nothing but the wind and the electronic hum. But I could have sworn I'd heard people talking, actual conversations, not just radio chatter or recorded messages. "Hello," I called out. My voice echoed through the empty building. "Anyone here?" Silence. I was about to leave when one of the monitors flickered and changed. Instead of weather data, it now showed a simple text message in green letters on a black background. "Storm warning, all personnel evacuate immediately." The timestamp showed today's date, but the time was 11:47 p.m., still 5 hours in the future. I stared at the screen, waiting for it to change back. When it didn't, I reached over and turned the monitor off. The screen went dark, but within seconds it flickered back to life, displaying the same message. I tried the power button again, same result. Growing frustrated, I traced the monitor's power cable to the wall and yanked it out of the outlet. The screen went dark and stayed dark. Problem solved. Except 30 seconds later, it flickered back on. The cable was still unplugged, lying on the floor, but somehow the monitor was receiving power and displaying that same urgent warning. "Storm warning, all personnel evacuate immediately." I backed away from the monitor, my heart starting to race. This wasn't possible. Electronics don't work without power. There had to be an explanation, maybe an internal battery, or some kind of wireless power transmission system I wasn't familiar with. But even as I tried to rationalize what I was seeing, other monitors throughout the room began flickering to life. Some showed weather data, others displayed scrolling text messages, and a few showed what looked like security camera feeds from around the station. All of them were unplugged, all of them should have been dead. I ran from monitor to monitor, checking connections, looking for hidden power sources, anything that might explain what was happening. But there was nothing. The equipment was running on nothing but air and impossibility. The voices started again as I worked, emanating from speakers I couldn't locate. This time I could make out individual words: pressure dropping fast, need to evacuate the mountain stations, lost contact with Blackrock an hour ago. Anyone still up there? I spun around, trying to pinpoint the source of the voices. They seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the walls like ghost conversations from some other time. "Who's there?" I shouted. "What do you want?" The voices stopped immediately, as if I'd interrupted something private. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own ragged breathing and the frantic beating of my heart. One of the monitors flickered, and new text appeared. "Get out while you still can." I didn't need to be told twice. I ran for the door, through the building, and out into the night. The wind had picked up considerably, and the first drops of rain were starting to fall. I made it halfway to the residential building before I realized I was being followed by light. I turned around and saw that every window in the operations center was now glowing. Not just the soft blue of computer screens, but a bright, pulsing light that seemed to breathe with a life of its own. As I watched, the lights began spreading to the other buildings. Windows that had been dark for months suddenly blazed with that same unnatural radiance. The maintenance shed lit up like a beacon. Then the residential building, including the room where I'd left my gear. The entire compound was alive with light, powered by nothing, defying every law of physics I understood. I stumbled backward, transfixed by the impossible sight. That's when I noticed the communications tower. The red aircraft warning light at its peak, which had been dark all day, was now flashing in a rapid, urgent pattern. But it wasn't the steady rhythm required by aviation regulations. It was flashing in groups: 3 short, 3 long, 3 short, SOS. Over and over again, the tower was broadcasting a distress signal into the stormy night. But who was sending it, and why? I forced myself to think rationally. There had to be an explanation. Maybe the station wasn't as abandoned as I'd been told. Maybe there was a skeleton crew still operating the facility, and they were playing some kind of elaborate prank on the salvage contractor. It would explain the power, the voices, even the impossible monitors. But even as I tried to convince myself, I knew it wasn't true. I'd searched every building, every room. The place was empty. Had been empty for months, judging by the dust and stale air. Whatever was happening here, it wasn't human. The rain was coming down harder now, and the wind was strong enough to make standing difficult. I needed to get inside, but the thought of entering any of those glowing buildings filled me with dread. Instead, I ran for my truck, thinking I could wait out the storm there, maybe even try to drive down the mountain if the roads weren't too bad. But when I reached the truck, I found all 4 tires had been slashed. I knelt in the rain, running my hands over the deep cuts in the rubber. They were clean, deliberate, made with something sharp, but when? I'd been going back and forth between the truck and the buildings all day. Someone would have had to cut the tires while I was inside, and I would have heard a vehicle approaching on those gravel roads, unless whoever did this was already here. Had been here all along, watching me work, waiting for the right moment. I looked around the compound with new eyes. The buildings blazed with their impossible light. The tower continued its desperate SOS signal, and somewhere in the wind I could hear those voices again, closer now, more urgent. He's still here, tried to warn him. Too late now. Storm's coming. I ran back toward the residential building, no longer caring about the supernatural light show. I needed shelter, needed to think, needed to figure out what was happening to me. But as I approached the front door, it slammed shut with a bang that echoed across the plateau. I tried the handle, locked. I ran to the operations center. Same thing, the door I'd left propped open was now closed tight, and the handle wouldn't budge. The maintenance shed was my last hope, but I already knew what I'd find. Every building was sealed against me, leaving me alone in the storm with nothing but the impossible lights and the voices in the wind. That's when I saw them. They were standing in the windows of the operations center, silhouetted against the glowing screens. Human figures, but wrong somehow, too tall, too thin, moving in ways that hurt to watch. As I stared, more appeared in the other buildings. Dozens of them, all watching me from behind glass that shouldn't have been able to contain anything. One of the figures raised its hand and pressed it against a window. The glass fogged around the contact, and in the condensation, letters began to appear. You shouldn't have come. I backed away from the buildings, my mind reeling. This wasn't happening. Couldn't be happening, but the evidence was right in front of me. The lights, the voices, the figures in the windows, all of it impossible but undeniably real. The rain was turning to sleet now, stinging my face and making the ground treacherous. I needed shelter, but every building was occupied by things that didn't want me there. The only option was my truck, even with flat tires. I climbed into the cab and locked the doors, knowing it was a futile gesture. If those things could power dead electronics and slash tires without being seen, a few inches of steel and glass wouldn't stop them. But it made me feel slightly less exposed. I tried my phone again, still no signal. The radio picked up nothing but static. I was completely cut off from the outside world, trapped on a mountain with entities that defied explanation. As I sat there, trying to formulate some kind of plan, the truck's radio crackled to life. Blackrock Weather Station, this is Denver Control, do you copy? I grabbed the microphone with shaking hands. This is someone at Blackrock Station. I'm not official personnel, but I'm here and I need help. Static filled the cab for several seconds. Then, Blackrock Station, we show you've been offline for 8 months. What's your status? The equipment is still running, I said, knowing how crazy it sounded. Everything's powered up and active. The buildings are lit, the computers are working, and there are people here, or things that look like people. More static. When the voice returned, it sounded different, older, more distant. Blackrock Station, this is your final weather briefing. Massive storm system approaching your location. Winds gusting to 80 miles per hour, temperature dropping to -20. All personnel must evacuate immediately. Do you copy? I'm trying to evacuate, I shouted into the microphone. My truck's been sabotaged, I need rescue. But the radio had gone silent again, leaving me alone with the sound of sleet hammering the windshield. I looked out at the compound and saw that the figures had left the windows. The buildings still glowed with their unnatural light, but the silhouettes were gone. For a moment, I felt a flicker of hope. Maybe they'd moved on, whatever they were. Maybe I could break into one of the buildings and wait out the storm. Then I saw the footprints. They were appearing in the sleet-covered ground around my truck, as if invisible feet were walking through the storm. The prints were human-shaped but wrong, too long, with gaps where toes should be. They circled the truck slowly, deliberately, like predators sizing up their prey. I watched in horror as more prints appeared, coming from all directions. Soon the truck was surrounded by a maze of impossible footprints, all leading to my location. The things were out there, invisible in the storm, closing in. The radio crackled again, but this time the voice was different, familiar. You shouldn't have come here. It was my own voice speaking to me through the radio. The station has been dark for 30 years, my voice continued, ever since the accident. Ever since the storm that trapped the crew and froze them to death in their beds, but the equipment keeps running, keeps trying to warn people away, and still they come. I stared at the radio in disbelief. This isn't real. This isn't happening. Oh, it's real, my voice replied. As real as the storm that's coming. As real as the cold that's already seeping into your bones. You can feel it, can't you? The temperature dropping, the ice forming on the windows. I could feel it. The cab was getting colder despite the heater running full blast. My breath was starting to mist, and frost was creeping across the inside of the windshield. The crew tried to leave when the storm hit, my voice continued. But the roads were impassable, the power was out, and the cold was so intense it stopped their hearts in minutes. They died at their posts, trying to send out warnings until the very end. The footprints around the truck had stopped moving, but I could sense the invisible figures standing just outside, waiting. They're still here, my voice said. Still trying to warn people, still trying to save the ones who come after, but some people don't listen. Some people stay too long and then what? I whispered. Then they become part of the warning. The temperature in the cab plummeted. Ice began forming on the inside surfaces, and my breath came out in thick clouds. I could feel the cold seeping through my clothes, numbing my fingers and toes. Outside, the invisible figures were moving again, but now I could see them not clearly, but as vague outlines in the swirling sleet. Tall, thin shapes that moved with the jerky motions of people dying from hypothermia. Join us, they whispered, their voices carried on the wind. Help us warn the others, help us save them from our fate. I fumbled for the truck's ignition, thinking maybe I could drive out of here on the wheel rims. But when I turned the key, nothing happened. The engine was frozen solid, the battery dead from the supernatural cold. The figures were pressing against the truck now, their ghostly hands leaving frost patterns on the glass. I could see their faces gaunt, desperate, marked by the agony of slow death by freezing. Please, I begged, though I wasn't sure if I was talking to them or to God or to anyone who might be listening. I just want to go home, one of them whispered, and I realized it was speaking with my voice again. This is home now, this is where you'll stay, where you'll help us warn the others. The cold was overwhelming now, stealing the feeling from my limbs and making it hard to think. I knew I was dying, knew that in a few minutes I'd be just another ghost haunting this cursed place. But I also knew something else. I understood now why the job had paid so well. Why my contact had been so eager to get someone up here. The contracting company knew what this place was, knew what happened to people who stayed too long. They'd been sending salvage crews up here for years, and none of them had ever come back. I was just the latest in a long line of victims, lured by money and desperation into a trap that had been set decades ago. As the cold claimed me, I felt my consciousness expanding, merging with the others who had died here. I could see through their eyes, feel their desperate need to warn people away from this place. I understood their mission now, understood why the equipment kept running and why the lights kept burning. We were the warning system. We were the storm alert that never stopped broadcasting. With my last breath, I added my voice to theirs, sending out the message that would hopefully save the next person foolish enough to come looking for easy money in the mountains. But even as I joined their ghostly chorus, I knew it wouldn't matter. There would always be another desperate soul, another person willing to ignore the warnings for the promise of quick cash. And when they came, we'd be waiting not to harm them, but to try one more time to save them from our fate. The storm passed by morning, leaving the compound buried under 3 feet of snow. The buildings went dark again, the voices fell silent, and the mountain returned to its deceptive peace. But the equipment remained, waiting for the next power surge, the next opportunity to warn the living away from the domain of the dead. And somewhere in Denver, a contracting company posted another job listing, offering twice the standard rate for equipment removal at a remote mountain facility. The pay was excellent, they promised. The work was easy. All you had to do was ignore the warnings.